All right. Thanks everybody for showing up. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to present this paper by reading it. I don't have a PowerPoint. I don't do PowerPoints. I don't like PowerPoints, just the text. And I will do my very best to speak slowly, but I'm a notoriously fast speaker. So I shall try my hardest to slow down. Here goes. Before I start this, let me say that it was a little bit inspired by a conversation at a PES session in 2018, where I read a paper about Rousseau and about Mary Shelley. And one of the members of the audience raised her hand and quoted to me a line from Muriel Reichheiser's poem, Kathy Kollwitz, about the German socialist feminist printmaker, Kathy Kollwitz. And the line is this: what would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open. And the question was sort of, how about this? And at the time, I think I just said, yeah, something, but I didn't really have much to say. I mean, it seemed like it took more time to think about an answer. And this is a bit of a response to that. Okay, by way of Stanley Cavell and Rousseau. So introduction, scoundrels to discount. Stanley Cavell starts his preface to Conditions Handsome and Unhandsome with a promise that the book's introduction will, quote, adumbrate the immediate pedagogical context of the concerns of the lectures. At the time he was developing the 1988 Karras lectures that became this book, Cavell informs the reader he was also developing a course for the moral reasoning section of Harvard's undergraduate core. That class, called Moral Perfectionism, combined Cavell's insights into mid-20th century films with his scholarship on Emersonian perfectionism, and was also the basis for his 2004 book, Cities of Words. The immediate pedagogical context, then, was a required course for elite college students, who in a core course could not be assumed to have any particular interest in moral reasoning. As such, even as they are a subset of the population subjected to philosophy and pedagogy, they are simultaneously excellent representatives of the mostly indifferent members of any polity at large. Cavell's preface is bookended with that announcement at the start and, on its last pages, another claim about its pedagogy. And there's again a quote from Cavell: I am not so keen as others seem to be to let the worth of moral theory depend on its being able to reconvince a convinced scoundrel, says Cavell. I am rather more worried over the clarification of the grounds on which the scoundrel may and must be discounted. Perfectionism presumes that we are all of us, undergraduates, readers, the rest of humanity, in a certain sense, scoundrels, though not necessarily convinced scoundrels. We are imperfect and subject to ongoing reformation. Within this class of the potentially educable, Cavell takes up not the project of trying to convince, but instead that of clarifying the grounds for discounting. Who may and must be discounted? Who counts? These are questions that have fresh political relevance in contemporary liberal democracies, many of which, including certainly the United States, the United Kingdom, and most European states, are seeing their social contracts frayed by divisive political rhetoric that divides the nation into those who count and those who do not. Right-wing populists most emphatically carve out those who count, typically white, Christian, native-born citizens, and discount the rest. For those committed to the political ideals of pluralism and justice, among whom I count myself and likely most of my audience, the surge of reactionary nationalism makes Cavell's question from those glory days of the late 1980s freshly relevant. May and must those of our fellow citizens who discount others on the basis of sex, race, birthplace, and religion themselves be discounted? Conditions Handsome and Unhandsome responds directly to 20th century social contract theory, especially John Rawls's A Theory of Justice. Cavell wonders in the preface whether the moral perfectionism he espouses is at odds with Rawlsian contract theory or is instead a necessary supplement to it. Contemporary challenges to liberal democracy provide reason to revisit Cavell's reframing of questions of contract and consent. Not least among those challenges are the arguments that the original contractors, Thomas Jefferson, who owned slaves and defended the secular state, Susan B. Anthony, who campaigned for rewriting the contract to include women and was irate when Black men got the vote first, and for that matter, Frederick Douglass, who got the vote and told women to wait. Must they be discounted, or at least offered at a discount? Should we, can we, given what we know already, keep on committing to live together under some renewed version of our social contracts? Or to put it perhaps too starkly, can Cavell help save liberal political theory from itself? As one very small step towards addressing those enormous questions, this paper takes up a conversation of justice that Cavell initiates and then immediately drops in his introduction to Conditions Handsome and Unhandsome. As he situates the book's concerns in relevant literature, Cavell provides a long list of writers whose work, as he reads it, engages perfectionism's attention to a basic dimension of the moral life, a dimension that encompasses personal relationships and the possibility or necessity of the transforming of oneself and one's society. Cavell traces this dimension or tradition from Plato and Aristotle to Emerson and Nietzsche, passing through moments of opposites such as Kant and Mill, and including such various figures as Kleist and Ibsen and Matthew Arnold and Oscar Wilde and Bernard Shaw, ending at, he says, his own doorstep with Heidegger and Wittgenstein. As Cavell himself then says in the next paragraph, the absence of women's names on this list of names should at once raise the question, where is the voice of the woman in this view of things? Nowhere or everywhere? His answer is profoundly unsatisfying, if not downright incendiary. His intellectual access to this question, Cavell says, lies most immediately or systematically in the thinking I have done about film. In his 1981 book, Pursuits of Happiness, Cavell explored the genre he identifies as remarriage comedies, a set of films made between 1934 and 1949, which have some or all of these features. They tell not of young romance, of how a pair will get together, but of the getting back together of a man and woman whose love has been tarnished, always through some behavior that causes the woman to discount the man as a scoundrel. In contrast to romances that feature an older male father figure standing in the way of the couple's happiness, Romeo and Juliet would be the quintessential example, these films typically have a benevolent father figure who supports the romance. The couple is always beyond the blush of first love, but still young and, crucially, childless. Parenthood, in other words, is a complication remarriage romances avoid, with Bringing Up Baby, in which a leopard is raised in Connecticut, serving as the exception that proves the rule. In his 1997 book, Contesting Tears, Cavell explores remarriage comedy's foil, the genre he calls the melodrama of the unknown woman. Importantly, for Cavell's purposes and for ours, the woman in remarriage comedy speaks some version of her mind. The story takes the perfectionist form of her figuring out what her mind is. In contrast, the woman in the melodramas is rendered by circumstances that drive the plot voiceless, her desires inaccessible and inexpressible. If the Philadelphia story is the quintessential remarriage comedy, Gaslight is the quintessential melodrama. After confessing semi-apologetically that his access to women's voices comes exclusively through films that are all written and directed by men, Cavell moves on with what Tanya Modleski has called a project of, quote, feminism without women. And yet, even as his introduction seems oblivious to the grounds it offers for discounting itself, Cavell focused far more scholarly attention than most male philosophers on women's desire, women's consent, and the significance of its neglect. In Cities of Words, Cavell adds an explicit invitation to add what's missing on gender to his discussion of consent, though he has still not, by 2004, found any actual women to include in the conversation of justice. He does acknowledge that times have changed. And here's an extended quote. While the aggressive playfulness and instruction between the principal pair of remarriage comedy involves questions and exchanges of gender roles, the topic of gender, while explicitly not excluded, is not explicitly and systematically explored in the following pages. While same-sex marriages or unions have become common enough to force a consciousness and elaboration of the economic and legal consequences for partners and for children reared in such marriages, it is too early yet to know, or I am too isolated in my experience to tell, what new shapes such marriages will discover for their investments in imaginativeness, exclusiveness, and equality, end quote. A sensible discussion of such matters, says Cavell, would have to take up the history of topics and encounters broached for a couple of centuries now concerning the education of women, from the time these topics were producing revolutionary thoughts, such as that men and women are essential to each other's education, under explicit discussion in Rousseau and in Kant's early writings. So this project of mine takes up Cavell's invitation to return to Rousseau, whose writing has curious commonalities with Cavell's. Like Cavell, Rousseau was a writerly writer, a master of wordplay, resonance, and nuance. Like Cavell's, his philosophical texts explore ideas about how we live together via genres that play at the margins of what is often considered real philosophy, and that to their admirers are all the more interesting for it. Like Cavell, Rousseau was not a liberal political philosopher, but he was also not a liberal in the way of, for example, Edmund Burke or Nozick. Like Cavell, he considered men and women essential to one another's educations, and like Cavell's, Rousseau's writing has been an object of both fascination and dismay to feminist critics. This is all the more reason to address the lacunae in Cavell by way of turning to Rousseau. What new shapes for investments in imaginativeness, exclusiveness, and equality can be sparked by a review of Rousseau's thoughts on the necessity of women's and men's mutual education? All right. Rousseau's education. Actually, I'm going to have a sip of water. Rousseau's account of women's education is laid out in Book 5 of Emile, where Rousseau infamously gives us the education of Sophie. Sophie has desires, voracious desires, says Rousseau, reflecting the contemporary account of women's sexuality. These desires needed to be restrained through an education in modesty and chastity, so that Sophie would become an object of desire to Emile, and in her uniquely acceptable desire for a life as his faithful wife and mother to their children, contain all of her other desires. Emile ends happily, with the married pair expecting a child, evidence apparently that the desire bit was working out just fine. Less familiar to most readers is the unfinished sequel to Emile et Sophie ou les Solitaires, Emile and Sophie or the Solitaries. The marriage ends tragically, with Sophie flirting her way through Paris and confessing to Emile that she is pregnant with another man's child. There are, the fragment acknowledges, mitigating circumstances, but Sophie dies before Emile takes the time to find them out. He then finds his way back to forgive her and starts writing letters about it all to his former tutor. Oh, before he was able to do those things. In the meantime, Emile has stormed off, taking their one living child with him, their daughter having died of a childhood illness, which set Sophie into the depression that caused Emile to take her to Paris, where he attended to his own public affairs, leaving his wife in the hands of her best female friend, and then returning the child to Sophie. Screwball, indeed. Rousseau abandoned what was to be an epistolary novel at just 2 letters, approximately 30 pages of text. Why then, in looking at what Rousseau had to say about marriage and women's roles as educators and educated, include this fragment alongside the finished and published Emile? In her reading of the Solitaries, literature scholar Natalie Boucher-Rogers makes a compelling case that Rousseau could only abandon this project, just as Emile himself abandoned Sophie, just as Rousseau himself abandoned all 5 of his and Thérèse Levasseur's newborn children. Her account also offers some insights into why Cavell, perhaps, also could not center the voices of women thinkers and scholars in the 4 treatments of the problem of woman's desire that he wrote. Those are the books I mentioned above. Cavell, who like Rousseau recognized the connections between the social contract and what Carol Pateman in her eponymous 1988 book calls the sexual contract, arguably could not because both contracts stand or fall together. If even one woman told the truth about her life, the world would split open. In Emile, Sophie's sense of shame is cultivated by her parents. It is up to the sex that nature has charged with the bearing of children to be responsible for them to the other sex, writes Rousseau. She serves as the link between them and their father. She alone makes him love them and gives him the confidence to call them his own. Sophie needs to be faithful, but it is even more important that she appear so, to Emile, to those near her, in fact, to everyone. It is important that she be modest, this is Rousseau's words, that she be modest, attentive, reserved, and that she give evidence of her virtue to the eyes of others as well as to her own conscience. If it is important that a father love his children, it is important that he esteem her mother. These are the reasons which put even appearances among the duties of women and make honor and reputation no less indispensable to them than chastity. What constrains Sophie's unlimited desires, to which this shame serves as a brake then, is how her desire is perceived by, and ideally rendered invisible to, others. Such is the aim in Book 5. In the Solitaries, a sequence of events that begins with the death of their daughter leads to Sophie's debilitating grief. Emile takes her to Paris, and then the couple grows apart, distracted, as Rousseau predicted in early books of Emile, and also echoed in his Lettres à d'Alembert, condemning the theater, by desires that are inflamed by city living. As Rogers traces out, once Sophie no longer appears faithful, and in the Solitaries, Emile never does explain how she became pregnant, only that she did, and that there were extenuating circumstances, so it is the appearance of infidelity that splits the pair and splits their world apart. Emile's link to his remaining biological son vanishes. After Emile leaves his son and Sophie, both die, narrativizing what Book 5 theorized. No longer a father, Emile becomes again the son, and having no role in any family, with neither parents, nor wife, nor child, Emile turns to his former governor, Jean-Jacques, to whom the letters comprising this fragmented novel are addressed. As for the real Jean-Jacques, to whom Emile served as a substitute son, giving him the opportunity to raise an imaginary child after having declined every opportunity to raise real ones, the Solitaries serves as the equivalent to Sophie's pregnancy, a creation adulterated by woman's desire, therefore a bastard, a monster of mixed blood, contrary to all possible proper formation. In Rogers's words, Rousseau will never write the follow-up to Emile and Sophie because the destabilization of the paternal function in this story cannot but reflect back on the narration. Rogers begins her article with the suggestion that Rousseau's insertion of women and the feminine into a text, quote from Rogers, happens always in the mode of deferral and of supplement, in a movement of slippage, which affects even the form, the aesthetic of the text. The appearance of a woman's story slides the text from philosophy into literature, as for example, when Sophie is introduced in Book 5 of Emile, and the philosophical treatise frames her story as a discrete subsection, a novel of sorts. Compare, Rogers points out, the philosophical treatise on the education of children that appears in Julie or La Nouvelle Héloïse, which is otherwise a novel. The text, in discussing the education of children, shifts back into a novel form when the question of the education of girls, raised in reference to Henriette, Julie's quasi-adoptive daughter, breaks the thread of the narration. And then it defers further discussion of girls' education until Book 5 of Emile, where its outcome is, again, deferred. When Sophie's name appears in the title of a work, as in Emile et Sophie, or the Solitaries, the text cannot but be a novel, and a self-destructing one at that, deferring its tale beyond the possibility of writing it, or so Rogers contends. Emile cannot bring himself to write Sophie's story. This is the character of Emile. Cannot bring himself to write Sophie's story, the explanation of her pregnancy, the consummation of her desires, in these first and only letters. Neither can Rousseau, its father and author. As Rogers concludes, the very insertion of the name Sophie, from Emile onwards, determines the passage of a philosophical treatise into a novelesque narration, and introduces already the seeds of its own self-destruction. In the title of the novel that follows it, in spite of the deceptive coupling, Emile and Sophie, one must see the introduction of a text placed under erasure. In the same way that the character cannot but bring the bastard into the household, the feminine fiction of a woman that is Sophie cannot succeed. This point of insertion is in effect that of difference, of the insertion of the other into the breast of the same, an inscription that in Rousseau can only be done under the sign of bastardy, and determines the marital unhappiness of the characters and of the narration. Such is the final yet self-erasing story of marriage and women's education that Cavell points the reader to. In a similar gesture of deferral, he tells the reader who raises questions about gender that addressing such questions requires a different text, and he inserts a reference to Rousseau instead of a feminine author. Is it the case, however, that Cavell, whose writing otherwise indicates no sharing of Rousseau's hang-ups about paternity and women's chastity, must defer women's voices? How would Cavell's world split open if one woman were to tell the truth about her life in his accounts of moral perfectionism? There are, and were, female philosophers who believe contract theory can include women and children, as well as female philosophers who in their address of relationships and personal and social change could be categorized as part of the lineage of moral perfectionism. So perhaps Cavell perfectly well could have named and cited some real women and just inexcusably neglected to do so. Alternatively, once women are allowed into the household, they adulterate philosophy and turn it into some other bastard offspring, such as literature. As Carol Pateman argues, in part through a piercing analysis of Rousseau, the social contract that Cavell joins his colleague Rawls in taking up first requires a sexual contract, which relegates women to the private sphere, to the uncompensated begetting and raising of children, subordinated to the men who dominate them. Only then can a fraternity of brothers overthrow the rule of the father and replace it with a social contract that renders men, and only men, free. Even to point this out initiates the process through which contract theory slips into romance. The genius of contract theorists, Pateman Riley observes, has been to present both the original contract and actual contracts, including the marriage contract as well as employment contracts, as exemplifying and securing individual freedom. On the contrary, in contract theory, universal freedom is always a hypothesis, a story, a political fiction. Contract always generates political right in the form of relations of domination and subordination. That's the end of Pateman's quote. To tell a story like Pateman's is to split wide open the world in which Cavell oriented moral perfectionism vis-a-vis Rawls. So perhaps the absence of hypotheses, stories, political fictions created by actual women was necessary to Cavell's project. Perhaps, To have included women as authors would have made Cavell's task of bringing both film and Ralph Waldo Emerson into the purview of philosophy departments, into the particular conversation of justice Cavell wanted to enter, more difficult, if not downright impossible. Like so much scholarship by women, Cavell's writing might have been slipped into a different genre of textual inquiry. All right, 3 decades on, can we do better? The above analysis of Rousseau's conclusion to the mutual education of Emile and Sophie seems to suggest that a commitment to including sexual difference in any answer to how we can keep on committing to live together is contra Cavell best not traced back to Rousseau. Yet, as the very fact of writing this paper indicates, I think there are reasons to look back to Rousseau. It matters, however, how and via which texts we follow his ideas forward. And this is more or less where I stopped the paper that I shared online last Friday. From here forward, I'm not as confident in the prose, which was one reason I didn't share it. The other reason was I really wanted to leave it open to all of you how we might go forward from Rousseau, and I hope we can address that in the question and answer time. I do have, however, in what I'm going to read, my thoughts on how we might move forward. So now that. Any way forward from Rousseau toward a pluralist egalitarian democracy would have to include texts that take up 2 of his major insights from a critical feminist perspective. First, the importance to any human society of the material and psychological demands of bearing and raising the next generation. Second, the inherent instability of identity. Rousseau relies on nature to explain differences that are social and political through and through, and this disqualifies his synchronization of Eros and Polis. As the Enlightenment's seminal visionary of modernity's key challenges, however, the tensions his work points to are still those that concern citizens and philosophers, at least the educable among us. One way forward needs, I think, to be rejected for all its significance within scholarship on Book 5 of Emile, and in general on Rousseau on sexual difference. French literature scholar Claude Habib, Le Consentement Amoureux, or amorous consent, makes the case for reading Emile's relationship with Sophie as a model of political and sexual consent offered willingly as a mutual gesture of love. For Habib, and the scholars whose work she draws on, including Ellen Bloom, who translated Emile into English, Rousseau offers a solution to the quote unquote cleavage, her word, between the advanced fringe of feminism and the mass of women. Everywhere, says Habib, the passion for equality encounters as its natural limit the desire to marry and have children. In offering a vision of amorous consent, Habib contends, Rousseau reconciles the 2 sides of his cleavage in a way that makes it possible for women who accept his vision to have it all: marriage, children, and a kind of equality. Importantly, Habib opens this book with a reference to a 1997 article by Jacques Julliard, L'Oncle Sam et l'Amour, or Uncle Sam and Love, which sees the United States as gripped by a paradox that makes coexist in the same country the worst conformism and the most radical feminism. That's Julliard's words. In France, Julliard and Habib will go on to say, matters are fortunately different. Due to the French national genius for love, they say, French men and women are still willing to play the game of seduction that, as Rousseau saw, makes them equals, even as they subject themselves to erotic relationships of domination and subordination. To conflate love and politics in the context of ongoing patriarchy is a dangerous tactic. It exposes other cleavages as well, as feminist historian Joan Scott points out in a chapter titled French Seduction Theory. Scott shows how these accounts of the French genius, which smooths out difference and dissent through the play of seductions, also supports anti-immigrant nationalism as well as sexism. Amorous consent, she argues, bolsters a story of French politics that idealizes ancien regime models of the relations between men and women. In aristocratic courts, men and women were equal in their powerlessness, subordinated together to the absolute authority of the king. In such a political context, there was nothing to do but play idle games of seduction, replacing political power with aesthetic and erotic pleasure. And side note, like in the actual chapter, Scott goes off into Lacan and gives a Lacanian analysis of phallocentrism and the phallic and how it works. I have not included that in this paper because it seemed like one direction of theory, far too many, but it's an interesting read. This is just the parts that, this is a nutshell version of Scott. One of the many paradoxes of Rousseau As scholars of French history, including Scott, Joan Lands, and Robert Darnton point out, is his writing support of both revolutionary egalitarianism and anti-bourgeois aristocratic norms. Scott calls the revival of ideals of seduction, with their invocation of ancien regime, plays of desire, aristocratic republicanism. She, I think brilliantly, connects them to anti-Muslim sentiment in France. In identifying the uniquely French national genius with consent to games of seduction that both accept an essential sexual difference and smooth over the political challenges of difference, aristocratic republicanism can disqualify Muslims from true French citizenship on the grounds of dress codes, the hijab. Ironically and impossibly, to reconcile cleavage, women are required to expose theirs. Dead end. And if the Solitaries is included as the real ending of Emile, not even a resolution that Rousseau was willing to settle on. Sophie's dress and flirtatiousness in Parisian Ancien Regime society is what collapses the idealistic political sexual project. There is, however, a better way forward. Among the enthusiastic early readers of Rousseau's Emile is Mary Wollstonecraft. In her Vindication of the Rights of Woman, she, far more than Rousseau, forecasts the kind of egalitarian marital relationship that Cavell picks out the Remarriage comedies for celebrating. Importantly, the marriages she imagines between educated men and women are characterized as much by friendship as by sexual desire, as was her actual relationship with William Godwin. Coeducation, she argues, is the precondition. If her plan for state-supported coeducational day schools were adopted, she says, and here's a quote from Wollstonecraft, "I presuppose that such a degree of equality should be established between the sexes as would shut out gallantry and coquetry, yet allow friendship and love to temper the heart for the discharge of higher duties." For Wollstonecraft, who, unlike Rousseau, actually bore and raised a child, the capacity of women to give birth and the responsibilities of parents to the next generation are not threats to relations between men and women. Pregnancy is not, when it comes up in her text, grounds for the storyline's collapse. Instead, the necessity of caring for future generations is all the more reason for women's education and women's equality. Like Cavell, Wollstonecraft emphasizes the education men and women can be to one another. Wollstonecraft told the truth about her life philosophically in Vindication. After she died of puerperal fever, Godwin, her husband, published a biographical account of her life, which included her affair with Gilbert Imlay, her suicide attempts, and her daughter Fanny Imlay, who was born out of wedlock. When he told the truth of her life, the public was shocked, and her writing fell out of print, mostly ignored until feminists revived it in the 1970s. John Adams, however, had a copy of Vindication. Though he did not follow his wife Abigail's request to remember the ladies in writing the documents that are the legal basis of the US's social contract, he did at least read them. A way forward should also include Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which builds on Emile and Vindication in its account of education, love, friendship, and social contract. Frankenstein is an extraordinarily complex text, which I can only touch on here, but in centering the relationship between Victor Frankenstein and the creature, as well as their desired, and in both cases unfulfilled, relationships with female partners, the text engages models of relationship that include but also explore alternatives to the heterosexual parent-child relationships centered in Emile and Vindication. It takes up child rearing, and it destabilizes identity, in part through its use of multiple unreliable narrators and doppelgangers. The creature learns language by listening to Felix de Lacy teach his beloved, Sophie, a Turkish woman, whose name is the Turkish version of Sophie. The educability of Sophie, a non-European woman, subtly makes the case that inclusion among the educable, and by proxy among those who can be counted into the realms of reason and the political, extends to non-European, non-white women, as well as to the creature, whose racial alterity has also been explored in recent scholarship. The book Felix chooses to teach Sophie to read is, oddly but significantly, Volney's Ruins of Empires, which I guess was a hit back in 1816, but is not really read by anybody anymore, and is in any case a really weird choice for teaching someone how to read. Its title functions as a warning. Inequitable power relations do not lead to happy endings. So if that were the path forward from Rousseau, the chronicles of a genealogy of the paradigmatic democratic problem that Cavell articulates, how can we keep committing to live together? You could move on to Emerson, and including the stories of women, perhaps add Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, an Emerson-inflected account of the education of girls during the Civil War, which was, of course, a challenge to the Union of the United States, a battle initially sparked by dispute over how votes would be counted, which ultimately expanded into a fight over who counts as human, which ultimately ended in a still troubled remarriage. Who else the revised genealogy might pick up across the 19th and 20th centuries, were it allow in the philosophically marginalized, I will leave as an open question for now, though I'd love to hear your thoughts. As not an ending, but definitely a standing point, I'd like to leave us with the words of a poet who recently appealed, following another uprising, which was supposed to maybe be a new civil war, but fortunately wasn't, at least not yet. This is a poet who recently appealed to all US citizens to keep on committing to living together. Amanda Gorman's 2021 inauguration poem is worth reading in full, or better yet, listening to her recite. But here are just a few lines from this self-described skinny Black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother. And these are the lines that I think most capture the spirit of perfection, of moral perfectionism that is Emersonian, Cavelian, what we're trying to reach. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. And yes, we are far from polished, far from pristine, but that doesn't mean we are striving to form a union that is perfect. We are striving to forge our union with purpose. So Cavell wasn't alive to hear it, but I think that makes an excellent addition to the project of reforming cities of words. And I will stop there, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Amy. So we have plenty of time for discussion. If you have a question for Amy, please feel free to put it in the chat. And you're also welcome to raise your hand if that's easier, and I'll invite people to ask questions. So, okay, I see Paul already has his hands raised. So yeah, go ahead, Paul.